And we are live. Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful Wednesday morning, also known as Hump Day. And today I have with me Barbara Bolt. And Barbara came into my ecosystem quite a while ago, first through a LinkedIn pod with Paul Higgins' pod, Build, Live, Give. And then she became a client and she did our challenge and then she did our cohort. So I feel like, Barbara and I are besties, and I don't feel like we are besties. We are Zoom besties. Barbara, welcome. And I just would love for you to give us an introduction, who you are, what you do, and also a little bit of your background, because your background is slightly different than what I have been hosting on this show before. So take it away, Barbara.
Well, thanks for having me, Nina. This is so special. I really feel like I've gotten to know you over the last several months as well. And I've greatly benefited from participating in your programs to the point where I'm probably going to sign up for another one pretty soon. So yeah, it's been a super collaboration, and we share a lot of things in our background, actually. So that's what makes our bestie connection here on Zoom. My background, well, I'm from the state of Iowa, which I'm going to stop telling people that, actually, but I'm from the Midwest in the US and had a very stable upbringing, didn't move around. My dad worked left at 8, came home at 5 kind of thing. But my first intercultural experience was actually being an exchange student to Japan when I was 17.
Wow.
3 months only. I was on a summer program, so it wasn't enough to become fluent in Japanese, but it was certainly a shocking intercultural experience.
I would say so.
Yeah, and it must have somehow rooted in me. I didn't do anything else, even really international travel-wise, for 10 more years.
Yeah.
But then took a trip to Europe, and then in '94, I actually moved to Europe, and I just expatriated myself. That was after a career in medical sales. I have a degree in nutrition, and I actually sold medical products for the first 10 years of my career. And then I was just bored with life and decided to shake things up and took this trip to Italy. And of course, met an Italian man, because that's what you do in Italy.
Yes.
Kind of whether you want to or not.
Been there, done that. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Many of us have.
Yeah.
I actually took the plunge and ended up moving back there to see if our relationship could work out. And it did not. It was very short-lived, actually. But I basically created a life for myself in Milan, Italy, and stayed there for 11 years. And then I ended up moving to Switzerland after those 11 and spent another 8 in Switzerland. And that's a connection that you and I have.
Yes, yes.
You are actually Swiss, which I was fascinated to learn when I first met you. And that's
because I didn't come across as very Swiss.
No, you don't. You don't.
Okay.
I wouldn't have guessed it. Your accent is extremely subtle, and your way of being is also not terribly Swiss.
Which is why I love New York, yes.
Yeah, there you go. And there are, we generalize probably too much in the field of intercultural communication.
Yeah.
But living in Italy is where I really developed my career in communication. Mm-hmm. Of course, the first thing I was able to do to support myself over there was to teach English. Mm-hmm. And initially I did teach it with a book and going to people's offices, and it was so boring. Mm-hmm. And I was just about ready to come back to the US, actually, after about the first year and a half, when I got this really fantastic job with a British company who used a full immersion training-oriented technique to teach English. And of course, it was 2 Italians because I was in Milan, but they taught their method all over the world. And that's really where I learned my training skills. Mm-hmm. I had a classroom of mostly Italian men from Monday morning at 9 or 9:15 to Friday evening at 5:30. Yeah, I know that real quick. You don't shame people for arriving late in Italy. It does not.
No. That's why I'm laughing. Yep.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
So what we did was we would take this group of people. They were leveled, of course. We had beginner, intermediate, advanced level courses. But with that group at their level, we would throw them into activities, see what they could do, and then teach them what they weren't able to do. So it's sort of a gap filler kind of methodology.
Yeah, yeah, very cool, very cool.
Yeah, and you had to learn how to manage a classroom because you had to keep marching through these exercises. And so it was very time contained. I mean, like this had to happen by break time, and then this had to happen between break and lunch. And so that's really where I learned my ability to manage classrooms and time exercises and all that stuff. Yeah, and it's where I learned presentation skills, how to teach it. That was my first.
Because I would imagine if you're having people in groups doing something that is experiential, but you still have to meet sort of the standardized. This needs to happen before the break. I mean, that sounds to me like an awful lot of balls up in the air that you're juggling at the same time.
Yeah, it is, and especially with Italians because they will go off on tangents. So sometimes it was like herding cats. You were like trying to keep everybody on the same page and the same. But I got really good at giving feedback. That was one of the skills I really learned in that job. And then I guess you could say I parlayed that into academic teaching, but I was invited to teach at a couple of universities in Italy. One of them I taught at for like 9 years. And so then I started developing courses. Yeah. And that training at Canning really helped me with that as well.
Yeah, I can.
So when I moved to Switzerland, it was actually for 2 academic jobs. So the academic teaching is what took me to Switzerland.
Okay, and that was my question. What made you move? Yeah.
I moved, I met people, I was connected with people a lot through Bocconi in Milan. And I got invited to take over a course from a German woman in St. Gallen at the Fachhochschule.
Yes.
St. Gall, in the Wirtschaftsfach, the business school.
Yeah.
And I taught at that institution for 2 years, and then they eliminated the course I was teaching. So I ended up down at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, which is one of 2 Swiss federal technical institutes. It's the French.
It's very famous, yeah.
Very famous in Europe, yes.
I mean, it's always a school in St. Gallen. I mean, that's after Fontainebleau and Kellogg, the foremost MBA machine, right?
Yeah, but I wasn't at the uni. I was at the Fachhochschule.
Okay, yeah.
I walked by the uni a lot because I lived close to it, and I'd go up the hills and walk up there. I love St. Gallen. It's gorgeous.
So that must have been quite a culture shock coming from Italy into Switzerland.
Oh my gosh.
At least you went into the French part. If you had gone into the German part, you would have been probably dead.
No, I was in the German part for the first 2 years.
Well, with St. Gallen, yes, you were. Yeah.
Yeah. And the big difference was time. I had become accustomed to the 15 minuti accademici in Italy, which is the 15-minute grace period. Yeah. And in Switzerland, I can remember having to just like physically drag myself out the door saying, you are going to be late and it's not okay. You know, as a Swiss person, you know that adage, if in Switzerland, if you're 5 minutes early, you're already late.
Yeah.
And that actually happened to me. I would walk into the meeting at 5 to the hour, and I was the last one to arrive, and the meeting would just start. Yeah. So I struggled with that. It was hard to get and to realize that in American culture, if you know you're going to be late, this is kind of funny. We will call someone. We anticipate that we might be late, and we'll call somebody and say, I'm sorry, but I'm caught in traffic or whatever. I'm going to be late. Yeah. Well, I tried doing that in Italy when I first got there, because I would miss a tram or something would happen, and I would call the person like at 10 minutes before the appointed meeting time, which already wasn't going to happen, and say, oh, I think I'm going to be late. And they would just be like, you're not late yet. Why are you calling me? Because in those cultures, they don't anticipate. It's just something they don't do. Yeah. But in Switzerland, if you call someone and tell them you're going to be late, you are not excused.
No,
I learned that.
You're still bad. That's a huge struggle for me when I'm home. Like when I'm home there, I talk about home here and vice versa. But when I'm in Switzerland, and I have this thing with my sister. So, pick up the nephew from, ski school. She's there a half hour early, waiting for him to be done with ski school or whatever. I mean, normally when we spend time together, it's on vacation. That's why the example of ski school. And then I always said to her, I said, like, I don't have that time in my life to sit around somewhere for half an hour and have an extra coffee and wait. It's just not how I operate as a New Yorker. It's like boom, 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 boom. And you're constantly running for the next meeting. And if you are New Yorkers, are very much the same. If you're 15 minutes late, it's gotten better in New York, actually. But when I came into New York in the late 80s, very late 80s, that was still totally cool to be 15 minutes late on everything. And then I remember it was my turn to pick up my nephew from ski school. And I was scrambling, and I had to pick him up at 3, and it was 2 minutes before 3 when I got there. And he was the only child standing there, basically nearly crying. And I was like, oh my God, I failed him so badly. But yeah.
Your New York aunt.
Time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, time is huge, and there's something very interesting about time. It very closely links to trust. Those of us who come from very strict, what we call fixed time cultures, have a very difficult time trusting people who are late. Or, and the people who come from the non-fixed or the fluid cultures don't feel the urgency. They actually don't physically feel it. So that I taught international negotiation for many years, and in the literature around that it's a huge reason why negotiations fail internationally, and people don't ever, aren't able to come to agreement, is because of the time factor. That's super interesting.
Fascinating, yeah. And I mean, I can think of a gazillion examples where that is true. Yeah, where in Switzerland, like, there's people that I know who. I have a friend who has a lot of migraines, so she just often doesn't show up because she just can't. And this thing is always, oh, you can't trust so and so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in my Italian classroom one year, I had a Danish student who, when we studied this stuff and I explained it, he's like, "Oh, this is why I'm so uncomfortable in Denmark, because it's very punctual." And I'm not a punctual person. It's true that we all have our own biorhythm, and some of us will tend toward, punctuality and others not. So he thought he was going to love Italy because it was so relaxed, and finally he wouldn't be judged for being late to things. But what he found out that he didn't like were professors being late to class, because that also happens, with the hierarchy and the privilege comes you can be more than 15 minutes late. And that bugged him.
Yeah.
So he had an interesting experience in that regard.
So, I mean, it's interesting because, there's so many factors that culturally play into how we live with one another, right? Time is just one element, right? There's, so there's the privileges that you get as an elder or as a more senior person. And then there's also, the trust around, how people deal with money, how people deal with food. I always found it really fascinating. I read a book, which I wish I had read when I just came to America. It was called The Culture Code by Colter. Colter is his last name, I think. Rapai Colter, a very funky name. Anyway, and it was about, he was an advertising guy who took just a single premise and then shed light on it from all the different cultures. And he said, because what you do in advertising is you take a concept and you distill it down to that one word. So the example, there were a couple of examples that really stuck, but the first example he gave is with advertising in cars. So if you advertise a car in America, the one word that will come to mind for an American around car ownership is freedom. And if you really watch the commercials on, I mean, look at all the truck commercials, or even a lowly Honda CRV. It's all about being in the great outdoors, right?
Yeah.
I'm sitting in frickin' New York. I'm like, how often am I going to get to the top of a mountain with my CRV, right? But then the same car or a car sold in Germany, it would be all about engineering and precision
and reliability. Yeah.
Exactly. And then he took it to alcohol. So each chapter in the book talks about, and it was
That's fascinating.
fascinating, like the language around these things. So the language around alcohol in America has been, uh, stupid drunk, stoned, sloshed, all that kind of verbiage that explains and actually describes how Americans' relationship is with alcohol. Where if you went to France, they would talk about savoring, enjoying.
Food.
It's yeah, and it goes on, and it's a fascinating book. But anyway,
I just wrote it down. I'm going to look it up. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, culture does influence everything. In fact, I was just struggling to write up a LinkedIn post this morning on how it impacts persuasion, which is super interesting. But of course, communication is hugely cultural. Yeah. It's, not only do we have different languages, but we have styles of communication that are appreciated or not appreciated. And that a lot of my work has been around helping people understand this, because it's technical. It's not just, the terms we use, like high-low context communication, aren't just in the normal lexicon by any means. But understanding how cultures differ in their way of communicating is so helpful, especially if you work in any type of global environment, any international company. Many people work across borders without ever leaving their home. And a lot of miscommunication takes place because people don't understand these basic cultural differences that impact how people are influenced by your communication.
So Elizabeth Buckman just chimed in. Hi, Elizabeth. And she says the culture code is by Daniel Coyle.
Okay.
I wonder whether there's two culture codes. I can see it on my shelf from here, but it's called The Culture Code with a V in front. So maybe that's a different book. And it is by Colter something Rapai, I think. So there must be two books, but so there's two books, another book to check out. Very cool. Thank you, Elizabeth. So you just mentioned that the way you work with your clients, I would love to just get a sense of, so the tagline of today's show is, creating your perfect pitch, clear communication in a global marketplace. So how, just to rein it in a little bit, because I know that you and I could go off on a tangent for the next 5 hours.
Yeah.
So how do you work with your clients? How do you help them get to that, let's say, to that perfect pitch or to communicate clearly within different cultures?
Thank you for asking that question. I appreciate it. My background, one of the things that I'm very good at helping people with is clarity from several different perspectives. It's sometimes it's linguistic. Sometimes people don't have the words they need in order to say what they really need to say. Sometimes it's cultural. Sometimes it's a style issue. And there's some message that they have in the back of their mind that is prohibiting them from being super clear and concise in English. And that can relate to sentence length. It can relate to intonation patterns. There are lots of different elements that play into that cultural piece. And then, of course, some of it is just basic presentation skills. Some people don't learn this. I know in a lot of cultures, they're very envious of us as Americans because we tend to start presenting in front of classrooms in like the 3rd grade. So we get a lot of experience, and other cultures don't have that. They just don't do that. So those are the 3 kind of pillars that I work with: linguistic, cultural, and then basic presentation skills. That can come in the form of content, and it can come in the form of delivery. Usually there are elements of both. But what I've recently developed is this process that I take clients through as they work with me. We start with discovery, which is me watching a video of them and them watching a video of them to discover what is their natural pattern, what struggles are they dealing with. Then the second step is that level setting. So we agree what the challenges are, and we agree what we're going to do about them and how long it's going to take. The third phase is what I call the transformative phase or transformation. And that's actually the fun part. I generally have, when I work with a person one-on-one, they present something to me every week, and it is recorded and it is dissected. So we keep digging into those challenges and why they're occurring, something that's critical to understand about becoming a better presenter is that you have to change behavior. Mm-hmm. And behavior doesn't change overnight. So it takes time to stop umming, for example, or it takes time to learn to make those shorter sentences that are going to communicate effectively. So that is why I build that transformation phase out about 6 weeks. So we are working together every week for 6 weeks and hopefully seeing progress, right? People are getting better at it as they go. And then the fourth phase I'm calling integration. So this is where we back off meeting every week. We meet more like every other week for a little while in order to make sure that those changes are sticking.
Yeah.
So that's my 4-phase process.
Sounds great. And obviously, yeah, transformational phase is always sort of the fun phase, and the one where, being a skilled coach, is so essential. And, I was just thinking as you were talking about before, about the linguistic, element of it, and how you plant these seeds, as a coach or as a person who works with people one-on-one, or even in a group setting, because you had mentioned in another conversation that you and I had that, or was it even in one of your videos where you were talking about the length of a sentence? And so, no surprise, I'm not a native English speaker. I've been in America more time than I've lived in Switzerland. I've been here for 32 years, going on 32 years. But my frustration, one of my frustrations has been that I feel like I'm super clear in my communication. I think actually I sometimes over-explain things, but very often things don't land. And the moment you out of your mouth came long sentences, I was like, oh, holy F. I know what's going on. And when I write, I edit myself much more, especially it's one thing if I'm writing for social media, because, there's that style now where you have a sentence, a break, a sentence, a break, a sentence, a break. So I'm much better in my social media writing, but when I'm just writing off the cuff to my team or, to a client or so, oh my God, that German habit of, it's like bigger than the screen, these sentences, these run-on sentences. And that just landed so strongly with me, Barbara. It was like, oh my God, I'm so freaking guilty of that.
Well, there are lots of people who come from lots of language cultures that have that issue. The Latinate languages one of the things that I realized in Italy is that Italians use a lot more semicolons than period, than full stop. And in English, we pretty rarely use a semicolon. It's very particular to use that in normal communication.
Yeah.
And of course, that sentence structure thing also influences intonation. One thing a lot of people struggle with is up at the end of the phrase. And that can occur for a couple of reasons. But one of them is that in the mind of the speaker, they're not done. They're not finished with a thought. So they keep their intonation up instead of going down, which in English is where you get power. You actually get power and credibility and confidence from that down at the end of the phrase. So that's another thing I work with people on, is to break up their ideas, one per phrase, down, and figuring out where you really have to go down. One of the things I often say is that if you're talking about money, you want to be going down at the end of your phrase.
Okay. Because you want to like basically put the stamp on it and say, this is it. Yeah.
This is what I need. And this is what I'm going to do with it. And not, this is what I need. This is what I'm going to do with it. Yeah.
No. So this brings up a really interesting question for you. In the back of my head, I keep saying Valley Girl, Valley Girl. So remember when, I don't know when that started, when people started talking always with, and isn't that now a generational thing rather than a cultural thing?
Well, it definitely happens for different reasons. And some of it is, there is a tendency for whatever reason, and I would say millennials and younger, to have a bit of this upspeak in their usage, and it can happen across genders. We sometimes think of it more as a female.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I perceive it, for sure. Yeah.
Right. And it was in the Valley Girl days. It was actually a cool thing. It was actually this positive valence. Now I'm not exactly sure if it's the Valley Girl influence or where it's coming from, but you do notice it.
It drives me nuts when I have one of those people. When I'm in conversation with somebody who does that upspeak at the end, and I wonder whether it's also coming from a place of insecurity, like insecurity. I mean,
well, it also could be that our culture has become very much a please people culture. Being liked and pleasing is it's valued, I guess we could say, and maybe that's somewhat generational too. And I think that up intonation it gives people, well, you could correct me if you wanted to, you know, or I'm not so sure. Yeah. But I do coach people to lose it, to really cut it out, because it isn't a powerful way to speak. It doesn't lend power to your message to have that up intonation. So when I work with, I actually have a younger client right now, and I'm working with her on that, because she needs to give a presentation that's going to represent the company, and she's got to have that power in her way of speaking. So we're working on the weeding out the up, as I call it.
So Elizabeth, thank you for sticking around and commenting. She's been giving us comments all along, so thank you for that. So she just says, the upspeak now signals that the speaker is uncertain. I would agree, but I also think there's a little bit of a cultural sort of, undercurrent in there as well, as we just said. So let's say, I come, and I've seen this happen. So I've worked with international crews. That was in the beginning when I started Clockwise, pre 9/11. I had, crews coming in from Germany, from Switzerland, and they would shoot here in America, New York specifically, but all over the country. And sometimes it was like, I would have like one heart attack after another, because the American culture, let's say you go into the C-suite, or even, top layer CEO, Fortune 500 companies, in America, there's this very, very deferential culture where the top honcho is like a semi-god, and you would never question them. You would never talk back at them. You would never criticize them in whatever way, shape, or form. And, coming from Switzerland, which has a super flat, we don't even have a president in our country. We have 7 ministers that run the company. At the country. So it's a very flat hierarchy in Switzerland. My sister walks into her boss's office and tells him what she thinks of him, and it's not always nice. And when she tells me something, I'm like, oh my God, how dare you? So I would have these crews running around, the C-suite, and just tell a CEO, no, you have to wait, or no, we're not ready, or no, you can't have this, or that's not how we're going to do it. And I'd be like, you cannot speak to these people like that. So when you go into, pitching, I would imagine it's a similar setup where, you come in as a foreign or, national, and you're asking for money, or you're asking for business. How much is that part of what you teach? Because that now goes into the cultural part, away from the language part.
Yeah, obviously, well, maybe not obviously. I shouldn't say obviously. Pitching in and of itself. When I talk about pitching, I'm talking about a form of communication. It's short, time limited. It's concise. It must be concise. It needs to be impactful. It needs to be persuasive. All of those things are difficult. And so pitching for anyone, no matter their linguistic background, is a tough challenge. It's really hard to get that message to land effectively. I think non-native speakers, the kind of context you're talking about might be a non-native English speaker who's pitching to an American audience. The language of money is pretty much English in the world. So people are having to pitch for support for their business idea, often in English. And if it's not their mother tongue, they do face an additional challenge in getting to that concision and that influence. Words really do matter. people, and if you're a non-native English speaker, your English is super, super fluent, but sometimes people have a thing where they know certain words and they use always those certain words. And maybe those certain words that they really feel comfortable with and are their go-tos are not what they need. They're not the words that are going to effectively really persuade their audience member. Of course, the going on too long and trying to put too much in is a big problem for Latinate speakers, for example, or other cultural groups. Getting to that true concision, where one of the things I often say in pitching is that every word matters. Every word has to be a word that carries meaning, because you don't have time for the blah blah blah, or that came to me in German, Spritzwort, the sayings, the kind
of a proverb also,
yeah. And some people will have those as their crutch. It's what they go to when they don't know what else to say. I have a friend who often says this and that, and it doesn't mean anything, but that's how she fills in when she isn't coming up with the English word that she wants. So those kinds of things can really impact someone's ability to be clear.
Okay.
When I work with native speakers, I find that the biggest mistake people make in a pitch is trying to put in too much information. They're trying to, I've only got a minute, or I've got 3 minutes, or I've got 5 minutes, or however many minutes I have. How much can I tell them? And the thing about a pitch is really it's a conversation starter. So you don't want to tell somebody everything. You want to tell them, you want to tell a very engaging story that's going to really help them understand the problem that you solve. But then you want them to ask you things. You want there to be a lot of questions in your Q&A. Not so many that it's obvious that you didn't get anything across, but you want people to want to know more.
I love the idea of a conversation starter, and you're basically teeing up the ball,
right,
for it to be then hit into the I love that. That's so less is more.
Less is definitely more. And that's, also a function of what the brain can process and how the brain processes information. If you just keep layering it on, you're going to lose people. And also with the longer sentences, people have to fish around in there for your main point. And in a pitch type of situation, when you need to persuade, you have to really break it down for them. Like keep your phrases very simple so that people can process one after the other, as opposed to the brain. I mean, I remember in Italy when I was learning Italian and learning to speak Italian effectively, I would just get worn out listening to the volume that they give you at one time, and then these strings of ideas. And I really struggled with that at the beginning. I got better at it as I lived there longer, and in fact probably started doing it a little bit in English. But it's in English, and particularly American English, it's that concision that really gets you the result that you want.
So if you're pitching, I mean, you obviously also are not even necessarily, as you said, the pitch language worldwide is English, right? More or less. So pretty much. So you might even be pitching in English, and neither of the two are native speakers.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if you could be pitching in English and your audience is of another culture, or it's a mixed cultural group, and in that case, your English, the precision of your English is a little less important. You don't have to be quite as accurate, because people will have that ability to understand what you mean, to interpret your message a little bit more. However, I've always said in intercultural communication that you want to err on the side of clarity.
I really agree. Yeah,
because people, I've written about, and I think the difference between high and low context communication. And the low context is American style, the high context is Japanese style. But the hallmark of high context communication is assuming that your audience has some common understanding with you. And when you're in an intercultural context, That's simply not going to be the case.
Yeah.
So I just recently wrote about high
Give us
context.
an example, because I thought that was such a fascinating differentiator. You had a great example. I think I remember the Japanese one because that was new to me. If you could give us that, I think that would be really.
Oh, you mean about the flower arrangement?
Mhm.
That
Yeah,
one?
yeah.
Yeah, I just reread that this morning, actually. So an example of high context, the Japanese are the most high context communicators on the planet, and they communicate very much without words. They can read each other's minds, and they pick up signals in the environment. It's called scanning. And the story that I told in that video is of a Japanese gentleman who leaves for work in the morning. And when he comes home in the evening, he notices that the flower arrangement in his atrium has been rearranged. The flowers are in a different position. And he reads from that his wife had a disagreement with his mother that day. Now, that is super, super indirect communication. We can't even imagine that could be possible.
I mean, yeah, it's like.
But in Japanese culture, that actually everything means something. Where people are sitting, who's in the room, what the flower arrangement looks like in the meeting, those kinds of things communicate. And for those of us who are very word-based and very used to not reading between the lines because we simply aren't trained to do that, we miss a lot.
Yeah,
we miss a lot in those environments. However, yeah, like you kind of said, if a Japanese person was communicating with an African person, those are both very high context cultures, it would be necessary for each of them to be super explicit because they wouldn't.
Because they're different, they read differently, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and then what would the same situation look like if an American guy came home in the evening and he would know that his wife had a disagreement with his mother or her mother because she would be shouting it at him as he walks through the door?
Yeah. It'd be verbal.
Yeah.
We only get that verbally.
Yeah.
There's no way he would know it if a spatula was in a different position in the kitchen. That's not going to happen. No. But we are, as Americans, we are amongst the worst at nuance and innuendo. We don't do it very well. And
interesting. So where do Italy and Switzerland land on that?
Italy, from a high-low context perspective, is in the middle. Okay. It's in the middle range. So it's higher context than the US, and it's also higher context than Switzerland. The Germanic language group is generally considered to be pretty low context.
Yeah.
Because German, even as a language, the words are very specific. They're extremely descriptive. I always found that, the Gebunde, blah, 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 all linked together, basically describes a building. Yeah, it's incredible. But the Swiss are interesting. I have always found the Swiss to be a mix. And one of the reasons I came to believe was that the Swiss, especially Swiss Germans, are higher context than Germans, for example, because of the dialect. I was told at one time that there are 46 different versions of Schweizerdeutsch, of Swiss German.
That sounds about right.
And I think it's because of the mountains. There's what we call valley culture, and valley cultures are very isolated. And in valleys in the olden days, they had to know when a stranger had come into their valley because they could be dangerous. And they knew them because they spoke differently. Yeah. They had a slightly different inflection, or they used slightly, you as a Zuricher, you can identify a burner, you can identify
from the boat. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very oral. It's an oral way of identifying people. But the US Swiss are also very group oriented. It's those valley groups, or those. So there's a lot of relational stuff that goes on in Swiss culture. Yeah, that gives it that sort of high context. I do think as Swiss, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you are one, but you do assume that level of common understanding to some degree. Yeah, would you agree?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's a tacit underlying current of what is proper and what is not proper.
Right.
And it's actually also, again, these things always manifest in language again. There's a whole set of language around that. Like my sister works for she's the administrator in the biggest church in Zurich.
Oh, wow.
So she's very tied into sort of the inner Zurich circle. That it's a famous church with the famous Chagall windows. So it's a big cultural institution as much as it's also a religious institution and a traditional institution. And so I've just seen since she's worked there, it's really fascinating how I even want to say her values, everything is sort of really tied up in a nice, neat little bow of do's and don'ts. And I mean, she and I have a phenomenal relationship, but I do see when I come in as a New Yorker where, anything goes and, don't tell me how to do things. And then we sort of come together. It's like, whoa, this is very, very different,
Yeah.
And I find it's not something that we clash over per se, but still there are discussions about my nonconformity and how it's not appropriate. And then on the reverse for me to say, like, you need to break
You're
out
so
of this.
conformist.
I know, yeah. but it comes from the way we live our lives, and it's fascinating. I find it very fascinating. But yes, there is, we call it, yeah.
Switzerland's incredibly fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating place. I found it to be.
Yeah. Well, I love my New York.
Right. There are upsides. But so to take us back to that point just for a moment to conclude it, it's interesting because you as Swiss Germans, you combine a low context language with kind of a high context social environment. So it very much is a mix. Switzerland comes up, it's higher than US American on the high-low context scale, and maybe similar a little bit to the Latinate countries that hang in the middle there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think also it's just because we have such different cultures within. I mean, you were in St. Gallen, and then you were in Lausanne. So, I mean, I used to do for years cultural coaching for Americans that came to Switzerland and vice versa on how to be successful in business, and it was a super lucrative and wonderful side gig I had for about 10 years. And the difference is I actually had to study when people went to Lausanne or to Geneva, because that was not my real house.
Right.
So I actually had to really do a lot of interviews and sort of get a little bit more of how really different the French Swiss are from the German Swiss. Yeah. And my family comes from, the Romansh speaking part, which is yet again completely different up in the Alps, and talk about, dialects and really different cultures, valley by valley. I mean, yes. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing.
So you really understand that dynamic.
Yeah, very much. And then the Italian Swiss on top of that. So, which are much more like the Italians themselves. So, I mean, within a country of only 8 million people, you've got 4 distinct different cultures.
Yeah. One of the things that it was kind of occurred to me at one point, I always thought that the French and the Italians should gang up on the Germans, to get a little more clout. But then I realized that there's an immense mountain range. I mean, they never see each other. They almost never interact. So
and they're culturally so different. I always say like the Koreans are much closer to the Italians than the Italians will be to the French. I felt the Koreans, and I happen to have a lot of exposure to Koreans in when I was growing up, and I always feel that the Koreans and the Italian have that exuberance of friendliness and the joy of being in contact with a lot of people and I don't want to use the word partying, but celebrating together. Mm-hmm. So I always found that that there was a lot more commonality there than there was with some of the other cultures within the vicinity of
That's so interesting, because I had never they call the German or the Japanese the Germans of Europe.
The Koreans are the Italians of Asia.
And the Chinese too. Yeah. The Chinese have a lot to with the Italians as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is a culture I don't know at all.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. So Barbara, just quickly, because you and I have worked together so much. Just in conclusion, because we're
Gonna wrap
yeah, we're going to wrap up because we've been running for quite a while. And then, and as I said earlier, I know you and I can go on forever. So what I really liked what you did when you did the video challenge, you did the cohort, you took your topics and you created series. I just want to have you talk a little bit about that for 2 seconds, because I thought it was a really smart way to create content in a way that, yeah, if you just could talk about that.
Sure. Well, when I joined the pod, actually, where we met, someone gave me the advice to pick a topic for each day that I was going to be posting. So I came up with content-oriented topics, cultural-oriented topics, and delivery-oriented topics. So that's how I broke it up. I may change that in the future. And then I start, in some of my pillars, there are mini series. What I found works really well is to find a topic that you can write about or speak about 5 or 6 times. So I'm always looking for those. I know in the delivery part, I did one on first impressions that ran, I think, about 6 videos. And that was lovely because that week I didn't have to think quite as hard about what I was going to create. One of the struggles I'm having right now is like, where do I go with culture? I'm trying to figure that out. But having those creating series, I think, gives some continuity to your message. And because the videos need to be short, you can tie things together in a series. And I haven't done this, but I think it's a great idea to actually have a conclusion of that series, right? This is the last video on, and let me just summarize or revisit those 5 points that I covered in the other videos. So I'm not that sophisticated yet, but I do think that video series are super helpful for people. And I think you correct me if I'm wrong, but they could be strung together as a course.
I mean, there's what I really love about what you did is also you started, I mean, you did a couple of things really, really well. And Barbara, I use you in my teaching all the time as an example, because you didn't just do one series and finish it. You started, you went horizontal. So you defined 3 or 4 series, and then you started doing one each, and then you started filling them in. And that gave you diverse content, because you might attract a client into your orbit, which is why you're doing all of this, maybe because they're interested in the culture part, or you might nab them with the linguistic part or with the presentation part. So by giving all different examples and sprinkling them in within the same week, it gives people something to latch onto, because everybody's a different learner, a different thinker. So I thought that was really smart. The series also give you an opportunity to create playlists that you can send prospective clients to who are on one or the other topic interested. And then lastly, yes, you can string them all together. And if you are topic-based in terms of what you're teaching, you also are creating videos that you can recycle. Because that is sort of that, the famous, I always hate that word, the evergreen content. That is content that is not going to change, in its
time limited
the truth is the truth about that culture. That's not something that's changing anytime soon. So I thought that was really smart.
I mean, because I'm a teacher, it's very comfortable for me to teach in a video. I can, and that's basically what I've done up to now. I'd like to branch out a little bit and talk a little bit more about my business and what I do and why it matters on video, and post some of those types of videos as well. And I haven't gotten to that point yet. But I'm still struggling with titles and logos and closed captions that I'm starting to get better at that.
Yeah, and that's just a technical aspect that comes with experience and with just doing, right? That's not, I mean, the hard work, Barbara, and that is what a lot of people struggle with, but you've mastered so beautifully, is the delivery, the content. I mean, for most people, that is the hard part. And the putting in a logo. I mean, yes, I would love for all my clients to have a little logo bug, somewhere up here in their video, but it's not going to make or break you. What really is going to make or break you is you giving awesome content and people being really relatable, which you are on video. So, I mean, that is really,
that's why I was so grateful to do your challenge, because I didn't know I had this talent. I mean, maybe I should have known because I've taught for so many years and I'm comfortable in front of rooms and groups, but I was really blocked about video.
Yeah.
I was like, how do I speak into the void? And how do I, I was very, very nervous about it. So doing your challenge in November just completely cured me of fear around producing video. And I highly recommend doing that if anybody has that fear, because it really works. When you're obligated to create a video every day, you just do it.
Yep.
And it does get you over the hump.
Oh, it does. I mean, I remember your first couple of videos. Remember, you were like leaning up against your table.
I was leaning on my desk, and I was very hesitant. And I was glancing over because I had a note over here. Yeah, I learned that I cannot have a note anywhere close to me. It has to be spontaneous. I do write my key points down so that I've written them and they go into my brain. I get into trouble every time I'm trying to recall a list. If I want to state a list, I will invariably, and it's like, damn, and I have to stop it and start it again. And
And I have done the thing where I'm like, okay, I want to get this right, and then I, sort of build it into my flow. So Elizabeth, who's still with us, thank you, is asking, when is the next challenge? I love you for that question, Elizabeth. Thank you. So the next challenge is actually in May. We always start the first Tuesday of the month. So I think that is May. You see, now I have to look at a calendar. May 4th. So the next challenge starts May 4th, and just go clockwiseproductions.com. You'll find the challenge there. And
I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a lot of fun, and it really works.
Yes. So Barbara, if anybody wants to reach out to you,
yes,
how do they best do that?
Email is probably best. My email is bb@boltglobal.com. I do have a website that is under revision. It should be revamped and back up in its new form by the end of the month, maybe even a little sooner. But the website is there, and it does have my contact information on it. So you can go to boltglobal.com as well. And then
LinkedIn, maybe. I mean, you are very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to see what Barbara's posts look like and follow her a little bit, be a lurker before you reach out. LinkedIn is a great place to find her as well. At least I love your videos, so I always love watching those.
Keep the pressure on. Keep the pressure on. I took last week off, and I'm trying to get back on track. So,
and again, feel free to recycle. You have awesome content, So there's something that's, I mean, a month old. The chances that the same people will randomly see it are so low that you don't need to. I mean, unless you're like a Gary Vee,
no, because
you don't have to worry about that.
I've got some that's almost 6 months old now, so I could definitely recycle some of that.
Yeah,
that might be what happens today.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much for your time and for a fascinating conversation. We've completely exceeded our regular time that we normally do, but I, for one, had a great time. Thank you, everybody who has chimed in. I haven't even gotten to everybody. Elizabeth has been amazing. Boris Ackerman, thank you for your comments, and Karina Schultz and Jennifer. There's a whole host of people who chimed in, so thank you for that. And Barbara, you and I'm sure we'll see each other before long. And
absolutely.
Thank you for watching.
Thanks for having me. That was great.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.